Hi everyone and welcome to the video presentation for module number 2. This is going to be a review of the concept of counterpoint. So our objectives for this is to review the practice, technique, and theories, all the things we talked about last semester with counterpoint. We'll also specifically review the terms species counterpoint and cantus firmus, what those are. Then we'll review how to compose the first species counterpoint. Now this is important because we're going to start writing music that has more than one voice. And whenever you have music that has more than one voice, you have to make sure that you're following the rules of counterpoint. So this is going to kind of feed into our next topic, which will be writing music in 4 voices, or like a chorale kind of format or style. We'll get to that in a second. But for now, we want to focus on our 2-voice counterpoint, which is what we did last semester. So let's talk about counterpoint real quick. Counterpoint, as you remember, is just two or more musical lines that are both complementary to each other and also independent from one another. So that means that the melodies will sound good together, so they'll sound good when they're played together at the same time, and they will also sound good on their own. So they both work together, but they're also good enough that they can stand on their own. And that's essentially what we're doing with counterpoint. We're writing, in this case, 2 different voices, 2 different melodies that will sound good together, but also sound good on their own. So species counterpoint is a type of counterpoint. It's really a teaching technique for counterpoint. It's a step-by-step method for teaching counterpoint, and we went through the first 4 steps last semester. And to keep things simple, we just focused on writing 2 lines of counterpoint, just like I was talking about earlier. And as you remember, each step of the method focuses on a different aspect of writing counterpoint. We had our first species, where we were writing counterpoint with just what was called consonant intervals, which we'll review in a second. We had second species, where we were learning how to handle dissonance in counterpoint. Third species, we talked about how to use melodic patterns in counterpoint. And then the fourth species was about creating and resolving suspensions. We're going to only worry about the first species for a review right now, because that's kind of what will lead us into what we're going to do next. So, just overall though, in each species, you were asked to compose a new line of counterpoint above a given melody, which we called the cantus firmus, or abbreviated CF. And this is what a cantus firmus looks like. And this is what it sounds like typically. So they're all really simple melodies with barely any rhythm, okay? And it has rhythmic simplicity because the real focus is writing a good independent melody and also harmonizing it, right? And it kind of teaches us the characteristics of writing a counterpoint. So the cantus firmus is really simple because we need to focus on certain things about what we're doing, okay? And so since each line of counterpoint needs to sound good on its own, the first thing we need to learn is how to write an effective single melody. And all these cantus firmuses were effective single melodies, so we kind of looked at them as examples. So when we write our own counterpoint, we need to make sure it looks kind of like this, which means it will be mostly stepwise. If you look at this, there are mostly only steps in this melody, right? And any leaps that we do have, like in that second to third measure, and then the fourth to fifth measure, and then kind of there at the middle there, those are all leaps, but they're all singable leaps, right? So they're either a third or a fourth. They're not anything that's too difficult to sing, and they're always balanced by a step in the opposite direction, okay? Especially that. And this is mostly like leaps bigger than a third, remember, have to be followed by a step in the opposite direction. This melody has a unique high point right there on that E flat, which means that's the highest note in the melody, and it doesn't go back up to that. So when we write our own melodies, that needs to happen with ours too. And this has a clear shape and a contour, right? So it kind of starts by going up, scoops back down, and then we have sort of a larger leap to the high point. Then it mostly descends until we get to the end, and that end is called the cadence, okay? In this case, the cadence, and in all cases, the cadence will be on the tonic note, and the tonic note is just the name of the key, in this case, G for G minor. Right? So these are the same things that we need to do when we write our own line of counterpoint. Okay? All right. So let's look at what happens when we have two different lines of counterpoint at the same time. So we kind of know what we're going for. First of all, when you have two lines of music sung at the same time, we create harmony, right? So that's created whenever you have pitches happening at the same time. So here, these two lines create harmony between each note in each melody. So each time we have two notes at the same time, we create a different harmony. And I've written the number of each interval there. 8 means octave, 5 means fifth, 10 means tenth, which is just an octave plus a third, right? So that's essentially a third, just bigger by an octave, and so on. So that's one thing we need to consider when we're writing our counterpoint is the harmony that's created, the intervals that are created between each note of each voice, okay? And another thing that happens is we have what's called relative motion. And that's what happens when each note of the melody moves to the next note. So for example, here we have an A in the top voice and an A in the bottom voice, and they move in the opposite direction to create a C and a G, right? And you can see that that happens throughout. So relative motion just means how the notes of the melody are moving relative or against the other melody. Okay, so let's talk about harmony. In this style of music, counterpoint, some harmonies are considered consonant, which means that they're stable, they're nice, they're pleasant sounding. And those are the octave, the sixth, the perfect fifth, the third, and the unison. Okay, those are all the stable intervals, the ones that can stand on their own. And other harmonies are considered dissonant. They're harsh sounding and need to resolve to a consonance. Those are things like the seventh, the diminished fifth, the augmented fourth, the perfect fourth, and the second. These are all things that cannot stand on their own. They need to resolve to a consonance. Okay? So when we're writing our first species, you'll notice that we're only using the consonant harmonies. And that's one characteristic of first species counterpoint. So you'll see that I only ever have an octave, sixth, fifth, or third here. I won't have anything else, okay? Because we are only allowed to use consonances in this kind of counterpoint. Now unisons, that's basically just the same note. Those are allowed to happen, but they can only happen at the beginning or the end. And intervals that are larger than a tenth, so an octave plus a third, are not allowed. So when I wrote that tenth there in the third measure, that's as far apart as the voices can get. And the first interval has to either be an octave or a fifth or a unison, like I said. And the lowest voice must start on the tonic. So in this case, it was the cantus firmus, so that was an A. And then the last interval, the interval of our cadence, the very last one we hear, must be an octave or a unison. Those are all the rules you need to follow to create two lines of first species counterpoint, two counterpoints that sound good with these rules. Okay. Relative motion, let's talk about that real quick. So there's four kinds of relative motion. There's four ways that voices can move relative to each other. One is contrary motion, and that's where the voices move in opposite directions. So here, I think it's a bass clef on the bottom, treble clef on top. We have a B moving to a C against a D moving to a C. So they're moving in the opposite direction from one another. Another kind of motion is oblique motion. That's where one voice stays the same while the other one does not. So here, the B in the top voice moves against a D and an E in the bottom voice. So we have a melody that stays on the same note, while the other melody moves to another note. So that's called oblique motion. Similar motion, this is where two voices move in the same direction, but at a different interval from another. So if these continued as lines, they would eventually intersect with one another. So you'll see here the first interval is a fifth, and then we move in the same direction to a new interval, which is a sixth. So the distance between the two intervals is different. We call that similar motion. And then the one you need to be most careful with is the parallel motion. And that's when we move in the same direction at the same interval. So here we have a sixth followed by another sixth, and the voices move in the same direction. So we call that parallel motion. And that's the trickiest kind to handle. Now the point of the motion is to create the most independence between are two voices, because remember, there's supposed to be two voices that sound good on their own but also work together. So they have to, the way we make them sound good on their own is to give them a degree of independence. So to make them sound as different as possible within the limits of still sounding good together. So the kinds of motion you want to use are contrary motion and oblique motion, mostly, because those create the most independence between the two voices. Things like similar motion is okay, because you still have some independence between the two voices because you're not moving at the same distance. And the trickiest one is the parallel motion, so that's the one you want to use the least. Now that doesn't mean that you can't use it, but it does mean that you have to be careful when you use it. Because if voices move at the same distance, in the same direction, they'll eventually sound like they are not two independent melodies, but two, you'll have one melody that's just simply being harmonized by another voice. Okay, so some rules about relative motion. First of all, like I said, parallel motion is the trickiest thing to do. So you want to avoid what's called a parallel unison, a parallel fifth, or a parallel octave. And that's simply moving in the same direction while maintaining the distance of a parallel, so 1 to 1, or a fifth, so 5 followed by 5, or octaves, 8 followed by 8. So you want to avoid that always. Now you can use parallel motion when you have thirds or sixths, but the rule is you can't do that more than 3 times in a row. The cadence should always have contrary motion by step, because that should sound like the strongest part that will always need to have the most independence. So we should always have contrary motion in the last 2 measures. That's the cadence. Okay, so there you can see we have contrary motion at the end. And you can have no more than 1 repeated note in a row, so no more than just 1 instance of oblique motion, and that happens there in the middle between that B and that D and E. And then you want, like I said, you want to use mostly contrary motion and oblique motion with occasional similar and parallel motion, but always avoiding parallel fifths and parallel octaves. So those are the rules of motion in this species of counterpoint. Okay, if you look through and kind of analyze all the motion happening, you'll see that it's mostly contrary motion. There you have oblique motion, then similar motion, then just one instance of parallel motion, and then, like I said, contrary motion at the end. All right. So how do we actually do this? Because you can learn all these rules, but that doesn't mean you can actually write an example of first species counterpoint. So last semester we talked about a technique of kind of making a plan, right? So step 1 is to make your plan, which means to kind of give yourself a shape to follow, pick where your high point's going to be, and plan out your cadence. So write the notes for the cadence. That's always step 1. Step 2 was to choose the high point and also choose the first note. And step 3 was to compose the rest following the rules that we just talked about. So it's mostly, making a plan, choosing some like signposts that you're going to follow, some ideas you're going to follow, and then when you're actually composing, that's when you're worried about the rules mostly. So let's go through an example here. This is my Canis Firmus, which was the first Canis Firmus we looked at, and we're going to compose a line of first species counterpoint above this Canis Firmus. So the first thing you want to do is listen to it. So if you can play it on the piano, that's great. And if you have a little bit of difficulty playing on the piano, you should still try it, even if it's slow. You could also try to sing it with solfege. That's a good idea too. In some way, though, you need to experience the sound so you kind of get an idea of the shape and what it sounds like so you can compose something that will sound good with it. So I'm going to play it first, and then we'll work on our top line. So this is the bottom line, the line that we're going to compose our counterpoint above. Okay, so by listening, you can tell that it's in a minor key. You can kind of hear its shape. You can hear that the high point for this melody happens in measure number 4. So I'm going to write a little note to myself that the high point of the melody we're trying to compose above happens there, right? Now it already says there's a tonic G, and since this is minor, I want to remember that in a minor key I need to raise the 7th degree of the scale. So in this case, that's going to mean that I need to use an F sharp, and this is going to be maybe somewhere in the middle, but especially at the cadence. So at the last 2 bars, I need to make sure that I'm going to include an F sharp. All right. Now, from this point, now that I have a sense of what this sounds like and kind of the characteristics, I want to make my plan. And it does say shape first, but I think it's actually better to start with the cadence. So let's start with the cadence. And I'm going to, remember, you can only have certain intervals at the cadence. They can either be an octave, so I'm going to write an 8 there, or a unison, a 1. So let's write those 2 possibilities. So if I were to voice this, use an octave here, I'll write the note G, and that'll be an octave. Now you could also have a unison here, which would be the lower G. Now it's only possible to use one of those 2 notes. Okay, only one of them will really work. Because you have to have, remember, contrary motion at the end, at the cadence. So contrary motion means that the note I write before that G has to be below it, and it also has to be by a step. So the note that I have to write right before that G has to be an F sharp, so if we kind of keep those 2 notes in mind, this note here will either be an F sharp as a 6th, right? Or it could be the lower F sharp, which is down here. Okay? The problem is when I write that, this F sharp is actually below this A, and you can't do that. You can't cross your voices in this style of music. So you can't use that F sharp, so that's not possible to use, which means that you can't use this low G. So really the only possibility we have is using the high F sharp and that G there. So let's stick with that since it's the only thing we can really do. And that's kind of part of this too, is knowing the rules and realizing that there are only a few possibilities that you can use while still following those guidelines. So use that G there. And so now our cadence will sound like this. Okay. So nice definite cadence in a minor key. Nice definite ending in a minor key. Okay. Now you could also write a note here in the measure before that if you wanted to. We're going to just kind of follow our ideas first. So we'll do these together, the shape and the high point location. So the shape is what we're going to draw here. We're going to draw a little line here where it says shape. Okay, and this is going to give us a plan to follow so that we know kind of what we're doing. So we're not just kind of guessing on our notes, but we'll kind of have a guideline as to what notes we can pick. And so we want to pick, draw a shape that creates the most contrary motion with the line that we already have. So you want to look at sort of what the line at the bottom does first. So the line starts by going up, steps down, has another movement up, and then sort of works its way down, up like this. And I'm kind of following along with the measure too. So this is a general shape of what our canus firmus is doing. Now this is not the line that we want to follow when we write ours, right? Because we don't want to have our line, our melody, have the same shape as the bottom melody. We want it to have kind of the opposite shape, right? A shape that's independent, that looks different than our bottom shape, okay? So since we go up in the first 2 measures, maybe our shape should start by going down in the first 2 measures, because that creates contrary motion, because our top voice will move down while our bottom voice moves up, okay? And then maybe we want to have a high point in a different place, because that will also create more independence between the lines. So maybe we can plan on having our high point here, okay? And in order to get to a high point, we should move up to it, right? Now that kind of moves in the same direction as our bottom voice, but that's okay because similar motion is okay sometimes. And then from here we want to move downward, and now our cadence has contrary motion, so we can kind of add our shape there. That has to go up, and then to get there we need to go probably lower from where we were at the high point and end up with something like that. Okay, now this is a general guideline of what to do. This kind of gives you an idea of what notes to write. Okay, it doesn't tell you which ones, but it gives you an idea of the direction that you want to go. Okay, so our shape, our location for our high point. So we're done with step 1. Step 2 is to choose what we want for our high point, or maybe write down some possibilities, and also choose our first note. Okay? And let's start with the second one. So let's start with first note. So we could either start this on an octave G, okay, a D, which will be a fifth, right, or the unison G. Okay, those are our possibilities. Now, again, you can't use this lower G, because if we want to move down, we'll end up on a note that is below the next note in our Cantus Firmus. So probably something like an F, right? So the G is not a good possibility because we don't have a lot of space, a lot of room to go, right? Now let's look at this D. If we want to start on this D and move in the downward direction, which is what we want according to our shape, we'd end up on a C, and that is a unison, which we cannot do in first species until the end or the beginning. So we can't do that, so D is not a good possibility. So the only possibility we really are left with is this note G, so we'll keep that. So we're going to start on a G octave, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of erase what I have here, make some space for what I need to do. Okay. And again, I can erase that because that's not what I want to follow, right? That was just giving me an idea of how to make the shape that I am going to follow. So I wrote that, kind of erased that so I can write the interval numbers here. Okay. So I have my first note. Let's pick a high point. Now a high point has to be above the notes that we already have. So it has to be above a G. So what could we use in this measure that would be okay to use above that C? Well, we can use an A. That'll be a sixth. We can use a C. That'll be an octave. Okay. We can use an E flat. That'll be a tenth. And that is about it. So I guess you could use the G, but no, you can't go higher than a tenth. So we can only use those three notes. Okay, so we can aim for one of those three notes. I'm not sure which one I want to pick yet, but those are the three possibilities. Okay, so we'll just kind of check that as done. All right, now we want to compose the rest. And look, we already have most of this done. We only need to pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then one of the notes here. So like 6 notes, and then we're done. All right, so let's just kind of go from the beginning and see what happens. So from this G, we want to go in the downward direction. Okay, because our shape says we should go down. And if we go down by a step, which is what we mostly want to have, we end up on an F. And an F is a fourth above a C. But that's a problem because that is a dissonance. We can't use that because fourth is a dissonance. And we can only use consonances. So let's try to go down to another note. So if we skip the F, we could go down to an E flat. And that's going to be a third, so we can definitely use that. So we had octave and then third, so we end up with something that sounds like this. Which kind of sounds nice. All right. Now we kind of fudge this. It kind of looks like we want to go in the upwards direction. So if we went up, we could go up to an F here. Okay. And that's going to be a fifth, which is allowed, so we can do that. Okay. If we want to keep going up, we could go to a G, which is in fact a fourth, right? And that's dissonant, so we can't use a G. We could leap to a, which is going to be a fifth, and we can't do that because we have a fifth followed by a fifth. So that's parallel fifths. So that will not work. Okay. Now what about if we leapt to a B flat? Well, we can do that because that's a sixth. Now one thing we have to remember is that our sixth, right? We have our leap of a fourth here. Whenever we have a leap bigger than a third, we need to follow that by a step. So this kind of ruins our plan of a high point, but you know, it's just a plan. So maybe we can just say, we'll just go with that A, and maybe move our high point over to the next measure. So plans are meant to be modified. So then we have a sixth, And then maybe here we can have our C for our high point. That'll be a 10th, which is fine. And then maybe a step down to a B flat for an octave. So let's see what we ended up with here. Okay, I kind of like it actually. So that's how you compose this stuff. And again, we're just worried about first species because that'll lead us into, you know, what we need to do for coming up with our next thing that we're going to learn. But always follow the steps. So make a plan. We picked our cadence, right? Our 2 notes for our cadence. We picked our shape and our high point together, and the shape was based on the shape. We want to have as much contrary motion against the shape of what we're given, the canis firmus. So that kind of gives us a guideline of what to follow. Step 2 was to choose the high point and also choose the first note. And step 3 was to fill in all the missing spaces by picking notes that follow the rules of whatever species we're trying to write. Okay, well, that is it. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions about this, but hopefully it's mostly review. So yeah, we will definitely go over this in person in Zoom. And thanks for watching, and have a great day.